Hello and a very warm welcome to Journalist Hangout UK, the show where we discuss issues both African and worldwide which are affecting the continent. And we also look at how those issues are seen at home and in the African diaspora. I'm Vuyiswa Ngqobongwana, and I'm pleased to welcome our panel today, Afua Hirsch, who is a journalist, a barrister and an author, Mr. Ayo Johnson, a journalist and specialist in African affairs, and Lanre Akinola, the editor of African Business. And joining us by phone from Lagos is Benga Onitilo, who is a political commentator and policy analyst. Thank you all for joining us. Benga, if I could start with you first, hopefully you can hear us all the way there. I really want people to get a clear picture on where Nigerians are with regard to this budget. What was the initial response to the final agreement?
Well, on the side of the citizens, it's more like finally the eagle has landed. And more so, it landed in an election year. Is the budget really going to serve the interests of the people? Or is it going to serve the interests of the political playmakers? So that's where we are.
Okay, but also, Benga, there was a concern about the increasing nature of the budget. It kept getting bigger and bigger, and Buhari was concerned about that being an issue further down the line, but he agreed. Do you think he agreed because there's an election coming up and he has to, or is there some other agenda at play we're not aware of?
Well, for me, I will just say the president is just whining over what he's not supposed to whine over. For the first time in the history of this country, we can say we have a National Assembly that is not a rubber stamp to the executive, notwithstanding a shoddy performance even on their own side in being able to carry out their oversight function in ensuring the budget was passed in time and seamlessly. This budget was presented sometime November 17 last year. Usually our budget should run from January to December, but it never happened. This is June. We're almost entering July.
Yeah, we're almost halfway through, yes.
The budget is being passed in an election year. From the history of Nigeria, election year not really happens on governance.
Okay, well,
because people are on the campaign trail, seeking for the election here and there.
Okay.
So by and large, we must not discountenance the fact from some of the things the president is trying to play, that like the National Assembly does not have the power of appropriation. The National Assembly, by our constitution as it stands today, has the power to appropriate.
Right.
Part of the issue that is a major concern.
Okay, Benga, if I could interrupt you, I want to bring in Lanre. There's a 20% increase since 2012, Lanre. I mean, in 5 years, a 20% increase. Do you think that is a problem for Nigeria going down the line?
No, it shouldn't be. The problem is that even at the 25 billion that the budget is set at, it's probably well short of Nigeria's financing needs.
I must correct. It's 20% increase since only last year.
Right.
So if it goes up incrementally by 20% every year,
it could probably double every year, and it would still be less than Nigeria needs to fully finance what it needs in terms of governance and development, just on infrastructure.
Right.
Benga already highlighted the key point, which is this money going to be used the way it ought to be used, i.e. to fund the running of government, in a proper way, and ultimately to help drive the Nigerian economy in the interest of the Nigerian people? That is a big, big if.
Well, Ayo Buhari did say that the reason he signed it at all, even though there was such a long delay, is to avoid further delays to growth. Are you confident there'll be any growth?
Well, we've got to be confident. Nigeria is one of the greatest nations on the African continent, a superpower, that's said. And of course, I feel very sorry for the president, because the president has wanted this budget to have been sanctioned and signed off much, much earlier. And this discord between the National Assembly and the executive has got to be sorted out, because it has literally hijacked the country. And ultimately, his own plans, personal plans to do with the projects that he had in mind, have all been sidelined, and the budget shrunk significantly. But I think the National National Assembly has got to look at itself in terms of its selfish nature, because one of the very few budgets that were increased were budgets that involved the National Assembly itself and private projects which they were interested in. And I think that's affected the president in an election year as well.
And also based on Nigeria's history, Afua, I don't think there's really much reason for the general public to have confidence in the government's integrity around the distribution of the funds. But there are some key pillars of society which Buhari was keen would continue to develop. You know, we're talking about infrastructure, health, security, housing, and the perennial issue of chronic underfunding of meaningful education for the future generations. Do you feel that's really what's at stake?
I mean, that's what's frustrating about this whole process. You know, there's no question that Nigeria has significant needs for public spending in all of these key areas of development. No one would disagree with that. But in a way, the worst case scenario is that nothing happens, that you have dysfunction at this level, that no budget is agreed, because that is the only thing that's guaranteed to harm growth, to harm confidence. And the reality is, and you know, I used to work on budget transparency in Nigeria, we still do not have a critical mass of people in civil society who are financially literate enough to be analysing and scrutinising budgets, to really find out what has gone wrong in previous budgets, why this spending hasn't been going towards the efficient running of the state in the way that it should. So it's very difficult for anyone to have confidence that putting more money in is going to achieve a different result unless something qualitatively changes. That's what I'm looking to see, and there's nothing to show me that this is going to be a watershed moment.
If I could bring that question to you, Benga, because yes, we're wary of just being cynical for being cynical's sake. Is there anything concrete that you can see that gives you any measure of confidence that something different will occur? Because it seems, yet again, that we're throwing money at the problem, but the problem gets bigger each year.
Okay, I just say we should just take a critical look at the frame overview of the budget. We have, before we get into that, let's just critically look at the critical elements of the budget. The budget size about 9.12 trillion naira. You are projecting a revenue of 7.1 trillion. We'll be spending about 2.87 trillion on capital expenditure. Debt servicing will be 2.2 trillion. Recurrent non-debt expenditure is about 3.5 trillion. If we look at 2015, 2016, and 2017 budgets, Nigeria's revenue earning has never gone beyond 2.7 trillion. There is no way in the world Nigeria is going to generate a revenue with the present structure, how we have worked with diversifying government earning, that we're going to generate 7.1 trillion in 2018. It's not just going to happen. So when we look at also debt servicing, the bulk of what we are generating, we are spending on debt servicing. So I'm beginning to wonder, how are we going to ensure we have the quality investment in critical issues like security, health, and education, which are the major issues every budget in a growing or developing country should be surrounded on. If you look at the budget on education, for example, at Bismarck, and you begin to wonder, are we really ready to build Nigeria or build the people?
Well, certainly the public relations, if I could interrupt you, Benga, the public relations work, Lanre, is really in full force. Of course, there's an element of electioneering, but we hear phrases like entrepreneurship, dynamic workforce, aspirational customers, and will the budget promote that to become a working reality in any shape?
Well, that's the beauty of marketing. It sounds good, doesn't it? And that does sound lovely. The reality, as has been outlined by Benga just now, is a harsh one. Nigeria can't afford this kind of expenditure. And if this isn't managed in the most judicial way possible, it's only going to make things worse economically for the country. The good news is all prices are up. So, you know, there should be a little bit of more money coming in. But this is ultimately, again, a question of governance. And in an election year, odds aren't that great.
Afua, a quick word on your final thoughts?
I mean, it is, when you hear those figures and the proportion of revenue that's going towards debt servicing, it is very sobering. And, you know, the reality is that not just in Nigeria, but across the African continent, expenditure is being financed through debt. So these problems are actually growing. You know, that's going to be a recurrent issue in future budgets as well. So when you look at the structural problems in the long term, I think that there are some really serious issues that need to be addressed in the way government is financing the spending. Nobody would disagree that Nigeria needs to increase expenditure. Education is the perfect example. This is a long-term investment in the future potential of the country, but at the same time, if you're funding it by debt, which is costing you almost more than anything else that you're spending money on, it's not actually solving the problem, it's storing up more problems in the long term.
Do you see any solution very quickly, Ayo, before we go to break?
Well, many would say that Nigeria should not be in that full stop. The oil sector, which has been booming for many years, with the exception of most recently when it collapsed and of course coming back up, should have been sufficient. But the not going into agriculture fully on Buhari's rule has been a sticky point for it.
Yes, right. Well, unfortunately, time's going really quickly. We have to take a quick break now, but we'll have plenty more to discuss, so please join us in a few moments. Hello and welcome back to Journalist Hangout UK. I'm Vuyiswa Ngqobongwana, and I'm pleased to welcome back our panel, Efua Hirsch, Ayo Johnson, and Lanre Akinola. And by phone from Lagos, we have Benga Onitilo. Thank you again. We are now going to an issue that really, you could call it the thorn in Nigeria's side, perhaps, Ayo. Boko Haram.
Yeah.
As usual, they pick Eid to focus their attention, people's attention on them. And current figures are 43 killed in recent attacks, in the Eid attacks in particular, and 9 soldiers were killed as well. And as you look at what Boko Haram are doing and the kind of PR campaign the government is pushing to say they no longer exist, what's your take on them now?
Well, clearly they're still a force. We were told they would go away. We were told they'd been beaten. They were told they would run. Clearly that's not true. This is an organization that's been around for the last decade, nearly a decade or so. We've been reporting on how sophisticated they've increased their mechanisms of attacking the Nigerian government and its infrastructure, not to mention the people themselves over time. And it's rather disappointing that they are a major problem, not only for Nigeria, but for the Niger, the Cameroon, and the Chad, who are neighboring countries as well.
Right. Benga, what was the initial response in Nigeria to these horrific Eid attacks?
It just shows that we are not on top of our security architecture. Our intelligence gathering seems very weak. It shows that the military itself has become fully overstretched in handling this issue. So you need better coordination amongst all the intelligence agencies like the police, DSS, NIA, DMI, in coordinating effectively with the military and understanding that these guys will always go after soft targets.
I agree with you there. And Afua, do you feel that the president's statements are kind of going to backfire on him as we move towards the election?
Yes, I mean, with all due respect, it sounds as if he's on a fantasy plane. You know, talking about Boko Haram losing control, being neutralized as a threat. More people have been killed this year by Boko Haram than the previous year, not just in these attacks, but 900, I think the figures, over
That's
970
right,
this year. This is still a problem that is costing lives in huge numbers. And I think we look at the changing nature of the attacks as well, you know, the increasing emphasis on suicide attacks, on using young women. If you look at the changing strategy of Boko Haram, it will suggest that it's becoming harder to prevent. These are classic attacks that are often very, very difficult to detect and prevent in advance. So I think for me, when you talk about Boko Haram, the question is, what are the root causes of this group? And only when the root causes have been dealt with will this stop being a threat. You know, I don't think that there is any other solution. Because we know these groups, we know the shifting nature of their allegiances with other terrorist groups across the Sahel and also in the Gulf.
But Boko Haram is a uniquely Nigerian problem, isn't it, Lanre? And that seems to be forgotten as it gets conflated into this general war on terror issue.
I'm not sure it's a uniquely Nigerian phenomenon. It's a violent militarism. Now its roots are...
Allude to the roots, please.
Yeah, its roots are, you know, disenfranchisement and the neglect of the northern part of Nigeria. So in that respect, yeah, there are contextual dynamics here, but it would be a mistake to divorce it from the bigger picture around the Sahel. The Sahel has become a territory of great destabilization It's a problem regionally that has to be tackled regionally and locally. It's not just a Nigerian problem. The roots are, of course, there, but it has very much spread, and it is feeding off the general instability that you have in Chad, Niger, Mali, and beyond.
Right, but the particularities, Benga, if I could bring you in, are about Nigeria's unique political specific dynamic between North and South. Do you feel, as you assess Boko Haram now, there has been any progress, even if tangentially, to deal with the issues that have created them?
Not really very well. The fundamental issues that created Boko Haram is still the same fundamental issue that created the Niger Delta militants. There you have politicians during elections arming militias to get involved in war, to get involved in politics, in taking governance. At the end of the day, when these guys take over, they abandon most of these young men. And some of them get into kidnapping, and that was how Boko Haram evolved in the northeast.
Right.
Part of the thing I keep saying is this: have we been able to deal with the sources of funding of this organization? Where are their fundings coming from? When you can deal with some of these key issues and begin to gain milestone progress against them, but as it stands at the moment, I think Nigeria needs more of international help to be able to checkmate this issue. Because
if I could, Benga, I'm going to interrupt you and bring Ayo in. How are they going to cut off the funds for Boko Haram?
Well, they're not going to be able to do so because they will not be using conventional means through the normal transaction that you and I would do in a conventional bank, for example. So they've used all sorts of structures in the past to do with charities, with other fictitious, to raise money that way. But I don't think the international money system would be able to capture them or stop that because they get the money through ISIS, Al-Qaeda, and other fringe groups as well, who I'm not sure exactly how they do it because I'm not a terrorist myself, but clearly they've been able to do it and continue to do it over time and successfully so.
Right, and it does get more complicated, doesn't it, Afua? You know, because I was mentioning a concern about conflating unique national issues to a general political movement that is going on, particularly in North Africa, where there's a lot of Saudi interest. There's all the world is looking particularly at North Africa and creating in Nigeria a kind of bastion, a zone to protect Africa from terror.
I think there are
and I'm worried Boko Haram is part of that.
Well, there are three layers for me to this. There are the constant phenomena you see with terrorist groups, which are often disenfranchised young men without alternative employment who do not have literacy that allows them to access the job market, but also literacy in their faith, because we know that people who are actually educated in Islam are less likely to join groups like Boko Haram. So often these groups prey on a lack of understanding about religion. Then you have regional issues, and you know there are some specificities about Nigeria and the history of northern Nigeria and also its position in relation to the rest of the subcontinent. And then you have these issues about the Sahel, the destabilization of the Sahel, the ungoverned spaces, the destabilization which Western powers have been complicit in. Yes. Destabilizing Libya, it's hard to overstate how much of an impact that has had on terrorism and people trafficking throughout the Sahel. Chad, Niger, Mali, northern Nigeria have all experienced the fallout, which the Western powers who toppled Gaddafi did not think through or care about what the effects on places like northern Nigeria would be. So there are very local issues, but there are also regional and global factors as well. And I think it's fair to say Boko Haram is one of the least understood terrorist groups in the world. People do not understand.
Well, some would even argue they're not a terrorist group.
And just to pick up on Ayo's point, you know, I actually did some work looking at international funding flows into Boko Haram. I say some work because it didn't get very far. It is incredibly difficult to trace any of the money that is going to Boko Haram. There are people who believe it's coming from global centres like London. It's almost impossible to find and stand that up. You know, so there are journalists who are trying to unpick this. It is incredibly difficult to do, and it's another area that's not well understood about how Boko Haram function and how they could be prevented.
Well, it's hard to know how deep the rabbit hole goes, but we certainly know, Lanre, that there will be a governmental response. The pressure to do something positive in the light of an election environment could create a draconian response. Are you a bit concerned about that?
Well, it wouldn't be the first time. Nigerian security forces have been implicated in all sorts of abuse over the years in their efforts against Boko Haram. We can argue about the context of that, but the response has already been draconian. Initially, they just went in and just killed people. That didn't work out. shock and surprise there. So yeah, we can expect more of the same, and the pressure to be seen to be doing something is only going to increase. So we'll hear lots about it, but whether or not it will have an effect while going in there with a sledgehammer isn't going to fix it.
Right, right. Final word to you, Benga, as you assess the situation going forward, and particularly as it's going to impact discussions around the election. What's the most positive thing that you think can happen?
So far, the war for me, I believe, you will not say Nigeria has won the war until we have people leave the IDP camp and relocate back to their region. That's the true test for me, that we say we have won the battle against insurgency. As much as we still have people living in IDP camps, I don't think that we have gained any milestone victory against Boko Haram insurgency.
And do you worry, Benga, that they might try and do something dramatic specifically to disrupt the election process so that we actually don't get there, perhaps?
Yeah. No, I think that's one of the things that have happened. If you check the last election as well, a lot of people were disenfranchised because of the war. They couldn't participate in the election process.
Right. Benga, I have to cut you with deep regret. I have to cut you because time is against us, and we hope time isn't against Nigeria moving forward on this perennial issue of Boko Haram and the inequalities within her society. But don't forget to follow us at Real JH UK on Facebook, Twitter and Instagram. I'm Vuyiswa Ngqobongwana. From the entire team here in London, it's goodbye and thank you for watching JH UK.